Well, we're now going on to our third talk of the day, and it's called After Their Kind, isn't it, Kevin? So can we welcome Kevin Tuck again, as we do if they're with you.
Okay, well, as you know, this talk is entitled After Their Kinds, which is a reference to the flood of Noah and the animals that went into the ark and came out from it again. But by way of following this series of very erudite remarks from my colleagues, I'd like to mention just a few comments which I picked up from the internet, that well-known source of great truth and responsibility, of course, by putting up a few comments that were made by children taking part in an exam of religious knowledge. Of course, we're talking about Genesis and origins, so these are some of the things that they said. These children said, in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, God got tired of creating the world, so he took the Sabbath off. And the first commandment was when he told Adam to eat the apple. The greatest miracle in the Bible, I'm talking to parents here, is when Joshua told his son to stand still and he obeyed. And last of all, Adam and Eve were created from an apple tree. This may come as news to some of you, that's why some people call their children Pip. Anyway, Noah's wife was Joan of Arc. Noah built an ark and the animals came on in pairs. Wonderful thoughts then. All views on origins. So we might well ask, how did life arise? If life has evolved, then we would expect to see very simple beginnings in the earliest fossil-bearing rocks. We should see a more or less continuous sequence of gradual change as things evolve very, very slowly over the millennia. So representatives left behind in the fossils would show very slow changes in a more or less continuous sequence, and there should therefore be no distinct groups, as everything is more or less related to everything else. On the other hand, if life was created, we should see the sudden appearance of diverse groups in fossil-bearing rocks. We should see groups of closely related creatures representing creative variations on a theme, and distinctly different creatures representing creative novelties. Problem is, which of those is correct? What does the evidence show? Well, if we look, for instance, at the so-called Cambrian explosion, which is the name given to the earliest layers of rock in which great multitudes of fossils are found, we find, for example, Stephen Jay Gould saying this in 1980, the fossil record had caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion, the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs. 9 years later, the same author in Wonderful Life, one of his many books, was saying the history of life is not a continuum of development, but a record punctuated by brief, sometimes geologically instantaneous, episodes of mass extinction and subsequent diversification. Stephen Meyer said the same thing in different words. The Cambrian explosion represents an incredible quantum leap in biological complexity. And the Levinton has said life's Big Bang remains evolutionary biology's deepest paradox. When you look at the rest of the fossil record, you find the same sort of thing. The missing links between major groups of organisms are still missing. The required enormous numbers of intermediate forms between ancestors and descendants are simply not there. In fact, it's a truism that classification exists. It is possible to classify organisms into groups, and we've been doing it for the last 250 years or so, ever since Carl Linnaeus invented the binomial system of classifying. We also find remarkable creatures with no close relatives, things such as the Peripatus, also called a velvet worm, very strange creature, like a worm but not segmented, lots of little legs like a caterpillar, antennae on the front that squirt silk, related to nothing else at all very closely. Or a duck-billed platypus, so strange that when skins were first sent back to Europe, experts here were convinced they were fakes, but they're not. Consequently, the evidence sure does favour creation and not evolution, and therefore, to understand life around us nowadays, we need to look at the Maker's, excuse me, the Maker's Handbook. So, the Bible tells us that life was created perfect, as David was saying this morning, for God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. It was created with astonishing diversity, for the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. But it was marred by the fall. Sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, affecting all the creation, as man was the head of creation. Huge numbers were killed by the flood. Everything, in fact, on dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. And only a remnant now exists. The world that then was perished. What we have now is just a remnant. As Paul says in the letter to the Romans, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay. A key event in all this, of course, is the flood and Noah's Ark, and everything on dry land that we have now is descended from what went into the ark that came out. We therefore need to look at the incident of Noah's Ark and what's said about it in the Bible very carefully. It says that Noah took into the ark pairs of creatures after their kind, not after their species. Estimates vary as to how many species of creatures there are in the world today. It could be as high as 50 million. Noah didn't have to cope with that. He just took the kinds of animals, not all the species. The word translated kind in the Bible is baramin, which is a much broader concept than species. For example, Noah only needed to take into the ark 2 individuals of the cat kind. And afterwards, after they came out of the ark, then they spread out into all the creatures of the cat kind we now have around us: wild cat, serpent, lion, tiger, cheetah, leopard, and so on. There's some important implications to this. For a start, species do therefore indicate genetic kinship, but kinds do not, because one particular kind is not evolved from another. And consequently, there's no single tree of life. In fact, this is tacitly admitted by the organisers of the Tree of Life project. They say this: the rooting of the Tree of Life and the relationships of the major lineages are controversial. A highly complex model is needed to adequately represent the phylogenetic relationships among the major lineages of life. That's a long, convoluted way of saying that it don't actually work. Instead of a tree of life, we should expect to see what you might call a thicket of life. Each tree in the thicket representing a kind that has diversion to species, but each individual tree quite distinct from the other trees, therefore have enormous genetic potential to diversify. Is there any evidence for this? Well, there certainly is. We can look at domestic breeds. For example, Oklahoma State University's veterinary department recognises no fewer than 73 breeds of pig, 262 breeds of cattle, and no fewer than 280 breeds of sheep, of which incidentally no fewer than 10 begin with the letter Z, so there's something for those trivial consumers. The American Rabbit Breeders Association recognises 47 breeds of rabbit. BAS recognises 300 breeds of goldfish, and there are no fewer than 332 breeds of pigeon listed in Wikipedia. I know, I've counted them. Incredible diversity, but all of this is dwarfed by the dog. And in fact, the dogs are particularly interesting because it's so well documented that they can and do interbreed with wild animals of the dog kind. Things like wolves, African hunting dogs and so on. Clearly, they're all part of one kind, and what we have is just incredible diversity within the kind. But it's the same when you look at wild creatures. There are no fewer than 38 species of mice in the genus Mus alone. There are something like 1,300 species of cichlid fish and 11,000 species of grasshopper. So, you might well ask at this point, well, what is a species then? And the answer can be a surprise to some. It's actually just a subjective concept. I wonder, Danny, if I could have a glass of water.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. There is no university agreed definition as to what exactly a species is. You'll find dictionary definitions, of course, but no full contingent of scientists will agree on them. And in fact, the old adage that a species is a good species if a good taxonomist says it is, still holds. Except, of course, that begs the question, what is a good taxonomist? Well, a good taxonomist is a scientist who recognises a good species when he sees it. Think about that one. Well, why is this? It's partly to do with the way we recognise species. We recognise them according to their characters, their diagnostic characters. If you look, for instance, at the diagnostic characters of birds, you'll find that we use things such as the colour and shape of the beak, the colour and shape of feathers. Fair enough. But if you look at the diagnostic characters of plants, they're rather different. We look at the structure and form of the flower, and the colour and shape of the leaves. So that begs the question of the relative value of characters. Is the structure and form of a flower equivalent in value to the structure and colour of a feather? Is one more important than the other? And what about the colour and shape of leaves? Is that more important than the shape of the beak of a bird? There's just no way of saying. These are subjective decisions. And that in turn begs the question of the relative value of the concepts of species. Are bird species equivalent in conceptual value to plant species? Are mammal species equivalent in conceptual value to insect species? There's no way of saying. We call them all species, but are they equivalent in value? We just do not know. It is not an objective science. So you might ask then, well, just how much variation is acceptable within the species before it ceases to be just one species? Here, for example, 5 ducks. 2 of them look very different from the other 3. Thank you. Excuse me. Pretty sweet. In this particular case, no, not at all. They're males and females of the same species, a mallard. But the situation gets more complicated when you look at it in more detail. Clines, not clones, but clines, include such things as seagulls in northern temperate waters. Now, on the left you can see a herring gull, on the right a lesser black-backed gull. They're easy to tell apart. One's got pink feet, On the left there, one's got yellow feet, one's large with grey wings, the other is smaller with black wings. Easy to tell apart. These two were photographed together in Poland. They do not interbreed even when they occur together. When you look at the other species, for example, down at the bottom is the herring gull, the big grey and white one I showed you. Its main population is over the UK, but it does go up into America, and occasionally it can and does interbreed with the American herring gull, the one up there. That one in turn can and does occasionally interbreed with the Vega herring gull. That in turn can and does interbreed occasionally with Barilla's gull, and that one with Hugin's gull, that one with the Siberian lesser black-backed gull, and that one with the lesser black-backed gull. But these do not interbreed. So is this one species or 7 species? Impossible to say. There are no strict defined limits to species. What we can say is, as they do occasionally interbreed, they're obviously all part of one kind, but they represent a lot of genetic potential, a lot of variation. Another problem is that of phenotype versus genotype. Phenotype is the outward physical manifestation of an organism, what it looks like. On the other hand, genotype is the internally coded inheritable information of an organism, what the DNA stands for. Now, we recognize species by their phenotype, what they look like, but that doesn't necessarily represent what's going on in their genes. Here, for example, are 2 creatures with extremely different phenotype, but identical genotype. If these were studied by aliens who had no idea of their connection, they would say, oh, these are completely different species. They don't look alike at all. Here are 3 organisms with very different phenotype, but identical genotype. All parts of the life cycle of one, a butterfly. So we see that phenotype not only varies between species, it also varies within the life history of an organism. For example, you and I didn't have teeth when we were inside our mother's womb. The genetic expression for teeth was there all the time, but it wasn't activated until later. Some of us might think we're going back to the womb. That's another story. In addition to these variations throughout the life history of an organism, they also vary depending on their environment. For example, British great tits have thicker beaks in the winter and thinner beaks in the summer. If you collected specimens in the winter, specimens in the summer, you might think there are 2 different species until you're made aware of this fact. Oyster catchers shape their beaks according to their personal food preferences. It all depends what they eat. Beak develops accordingly. And Lace and Isle finches, Lace and Isles are close to the Hawaiian Isles, were the site of a deliberate introduction of finches in the 1960s as an evolutionary experiment. And they found that their bill shapes adapted very rapidly. Is this evolution? No, it's just variation within the kind. The genetic potential is there all the time. But the differences in environment and other factors have led to these changes. It's not the development of new information, it's simply the varied expression of existing information. So what then of Darwin's finches? The finches we're talking about occur on the Galapagos Islands of South America. Darwin's finches were found, though not by Darwin, who was a very poor ornithologist, to amount to no fewer than 14 different species in 4 genera the melodies varying between species, and the beats varying from small and fine to large parrot-like. Is this evolution? No, it's just variation within the kind, same as everything else I've already talked about. And the same goes for the Galapagos tortoises, the peppered moth, the MRSA bug, and all the other examples that are touted by evolutionists. It's just variation within kind. In fact, you might ask then, if it's not evolution, what is it? It would be more accurate to say it's devolution, and I'll explain why. What I'm saying is that from the original kind that came out of Noah's Ark, the genetic potential allowed it to splinter out into lots of different species. But over time, some of these fared less well than the others, and eventually they became extinct. In fact, in some cases, what's left is such a miserable remnant that it's impossible to say what the original kind might have been. We're left with just a few shards from the original richness of genetic potential available. And this really is the history of life on Earth from the days of the Ark. The history of Earth is a history of extinction, not of evolution. There are so many groups that are now completely extinct or nearly extinct. Trilobites, for example, completely extinct. Ammonites, completely extinct. Toxodonts, so completely extinct, most people never even heard of them. Giant sloths, completely extinct. The ginkgo, it's only one living species, but there's loads known in the fossil record. Tuataras, only 2 living species. Elephants, only 3 living species, about a dozen or so known in the fossil record. Paper nautilus, only 7 living species, once widespread, as far as we can tell from the fossil record. And dinosaurs, almost extinct. In fact, when you look at any one group or region, you find this same depressing story all the time. If we look at just European mammals, we have lost so much already. The cave bear, the Caspian tiger, the European cave lions, the Sardinian lynx, several Mediterranean dwarf elephants, the straight-tusked elephant, woolly mammoth, the European hippo, the Cretan dwarf hippo, several other Mediterranean hippos, the Dinotherium, which is an enormous creature, Dinofelis, the so-called giant unicorn, the Elasmotherium, the woolly rhino. It just goes on and on. We've lost the aurochs, the original wild cattle. We've lost wisents. Bet you didn't know that. We've lost the Balearic cave goat, 2 subspecies of ibex, Caucasian moose, the Irish elk, the tarpan, the European ass, the megasaurine, a Mallorcan hare, various giant rats and shrews, pikas, spiny mouse, dormice, and even a Sardinian dole. This is just the ones we know about, never mind the ones we don't. And this is just mammals. What about if we added in birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and so on? And what about if we added in all the other major areas of the world? What we're seeing is a continuing degradation and loss all the time. Not evolution, devolution. In fact, it's entropy, which talks about the inevitable and continual degradation of the system. And the Bible says exactly the same thing, where it says the creation was subjected to frustration not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. This is pretty bleak. This is depressing. Is there any hope at all? Fortunately, there is. The Bible goes on to say, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So what then of the future? Well, fortunately, we're told the future. As the Apostle John, the last book of the Bible, has this to say. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.'" It's making making everything new. Well, might I ask then, where do you stand? Most people here are Christians, I'm sure, but perhaps some aren't. May I ask, have you made your peace with God? The clock is ticking. None of us even know if we've got tomorrow. If you haven't made your peace with God, to fall into a lost eternity is a terrible thing. There is only one way to God. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father," it said, "through me." So I would urge you, if you haven't already done so, to make sure you know where your future is going. Because without Jesus, it's very dark indeed.